Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I'm welcoming back author Helene Harrison to discuss her brand new book, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn. Helene Harrison studied at the University of Northumbria in Newcastle, achieving both a BA and an MA in history before going on to complete an MSc in library management. Her master's dissertation focused on portrayals of Anne Boleyn through the centuries, from contemporary letters to modern TV and film adaptations. She now writes 2 blogs, one on Tudor history and one book related, and works in the University Library of her alma mater. Her books are Elizabethan Rebellions, Conspiracy, Intrigue and Treason, Tudor Executions from Nobility to the Block, and The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, Interpreting Image and Perception. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Helen. How are you?
Hi, Jess. I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm really excited to discuss your brand new book. I think I've been pestering you for about a year about it.
Yeah, and I haven't even finished writing it then.
Yeah. You finished yet? It's published. Before we go on to your book, I thought we could discuss a little bit about you for any new listeners. So could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, I was brought up around history. Family camping trips as a child. We'd go visiting castles and abbeys and other ruins and things like that. My dad was always interested in military and naval history, so he has quite a large collection of history books already. They're a bit different from what I choose to focus on.
What was the inspiration for this book in particular? Where did that stem from?
It came from kind of a combination of my undergrad and postgrad dissertations, which I completed in 2012 and 2013. My postgrad one was actually called The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, which is where the name for this book came from. But my undergrad one discussed Anne Boleyn's public image, so sort of how she was perceived in her lifetime largely. And then my postgrad one kind of followed on because it was in literature, film, and theatre. So that was sort of after her death. So this book combines the two and then expands it a bit further as well.
I mean, it is really excellent. I was able to read it via NetGalley, and it is a masterpiece, Helen. It really is.
Thank you very much, Jess.
What would you like people to learn from reading this book?
I guess the idea behind writing the book was that I've always been fascinated about why we believe what we do about historical figures when there's not always a lot of evidence. How do we sort of reach those conclusions? So I wanted to go back and look at what do we actually know from Anne's lifetime, and then how have things been built up around it, and where do these things come from? Do they come from later sources, or is it something that's just been made up and then passed down as legend? But I think it's important to understand how perceptions can change over time and how we embellish things, and what we can learn from deconstructing the embellishments that have been added. And things like film and television are only very loosely based on fact anyway. They are dramas and made to entertain. But I also think it's important to understand when you're researching something, it's not just about reading the contemporary sources and then reading the most up-to-date literature. It's about going back through the literature and understanding how things have changed over time and how the layers have been built. I did have a comment on, I think it was on Instagram, about a stack of books that I'd bought, and I can't remember who it was, but someone commented saying these are all really old. And I just said, well, yeah, it's important to understand that older historiography and how we build on it today.
I mean, older history books might have different sources than what we would use today. Not everything survives time.
Yes, there is that as well. But yeah, I'm always interested in how historians have changed viewpoints and what was it that prompted that? Was it some kind of new discovery or have things just sort of changed over time, really? I guess as we're all influenced by the times we write in. So has the fact that we're now living in a more modern age, we have new technologies, have things like that influenced how we look at the past?
No, I agree. I think, especially when it comes to Anne Boleyn, who's so mythologized, so many myths about her, and it's what's true. And I think this book does a really good job of kind of going through how she is in her own lifetime, which I think is really important. And I think exploring her after death to then go onto the books and the TV, I think was quite important to differentiate that, especially.
Yeah, I think it works really well. And yeah, it's a similar format to how I did my undergrad and my postgrad. I think it was my undergrad where I did Anne Boleyn as Queen and Mother, Anne Boleyn as traitor. So that idea sort of followed through into the book.
In terms of how Anne is actually viewed in her own lifetime, what actual portraiture do we have, and how do we know what Anne looks like?
It's difficult to know. The only sort of concrete portrait we have is the 1534 portrait medal, which is hugely damaged now. But it is later damage to Anne's lifetime. I think it was 18th, 19th century, the damage, because we have a sketch of the medal from that period from before it was damaged. So it wasn't done, after her execution as someone trying to damage her image, um, because we do have that surviving sketch from later on. And I do believe that this was created in expectation of the birth of a son in 1534 from Anne's second pregnancy. Um, but most portraits we have, the Hever Rose, the National Portrait Gallery, were all created much later in the Elizabethan period. And the face shape is very similar to Elizabeth. So whether they used Elizabeth's facial shape from a portrait of her to create one of Anne. And again, there's a lot of questions over, is there a portrait that does survive and perhaps has been misdated at some point? There's sort of obscure reference to a portrait of Anne Boleyn in the collection of Lord Lumley as late as 1770. Whether that still survives or has since been lost to time or has been misidentified as someone else, I don't know. And I know Hever Castle are currently doing some work to date the Hever Rose portrait. I think the results of that are due in 2026, so hopefully not long to wait. But I do believe the Holbein Windsor sketch is Anne.
Hmm.
The one she's wearing a sort of what looks almost like a nightgown and bonnet. It's a sort of deshabille one. I do believe that is Anne. And partly I think it's Anne because I believe she's quite possibly wearing the nightgown that Henry VIII commissioned for her. And we know Henry Fitzroy was painted in a similar state of undress. We have a miniature of Henry Fitzroy in similar garb. So I don't think necessarily Anne's rank would have been a barrier to that. I think probably her rank was probably one of the reasons why she could be painted like that. If it was to become a personal miniature for Henry VIII, I think that's possible. So we don't really know much from portraits of what Anne looked like. And even the sort of contemporary accounts are not very full, let's say. They describe her as oval-faced, sallow-skinned, dark eyes, but that's about all we know. There's a lot of debate over hair colour. I haven't been able to find a contemporary description of hair colour, and it would all be a bit subjective anyway, because I think today we interpret colour very differently how they did. Nowadays, if we say dark, we'd be thinking black.
Mm.
Back then, it could have been dark auburn, dark blonde.
Yeah.
So I think the question of her hair color is an interesting one. I do think she had a reddish tint to her hair because in that Windsor sketch and um, one of the portraits, which is alleged to be Anne, although I will caveat that to say it's also been identified as Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour. Um, but I do think she had a reddish tinge. We know Holbein used some reddish chalk in the Windsor sketch, although it's possible at least a couple of the upper layers of that may have rubbed off over time. But I don't think he would have used reddish chalk if she didn't have some kind of reddish tinge to
Mm.
her hair. So there's things we can infer, but not a lot we actually know for sure.
It's insane, I think, isn't it? I think we've discussed this before, Helen, like in our messages, that for a woman that is so talked about, we don't really know what she looked like.
No, we don't know how old she was. We don't know what she looked like. We don't know how she was educated. We don't really have much information at all, really, about it's particularly the early years, but it's a bit unusual not to know what she looked like.
I mean, it really is, but it's like either stuff got destroyed by Henry after her downfall,
Hmm.
or things were just lost over time, or private collections.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any concrete evidence to say things were destroyed, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. But I just think we need to be careful about. I see a lot of people asserting, well, Henry did destroy these things. We don't know that actually. The only sort of thing we have, there's a reference to, I think it's in the Privy Purse accounts, to say that the emblems of Anne Boleyn and Wolsey were to be replaced. But that's a generic thing that would happen after the death of pretty much any queen. We see emblems being replaced a lot. So that's not necessarily significant.
What do courtiers, ambassadors, and the people who knew Anne say about Anne, and do we have any kind of what they say about her appearance as well?
Um, like I said, there's not really many actual contemporary descriptions of her appearance. The focus isn't really on Anne's appearance, it's on her wit, her charisma, her intelligence, her sparkle. Um, yeah, we only have sort of have the descriptions of sallow skin, oval face, dark black and beautiful eyes, I think is the description that's used. And she's often compared almost unfavorably with Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour, not matching that contemporary sort of ideal of beauty. But then Jane Seymour doesn't tend to get particularly favorable accounts about her appearance either. So yeah, it's a bit of a strange one, really. Ambassadors sort of seem to struggle to understand Anne's appeal from what they saw of her appearance.
Mm.
So they seem to conclude was that what appealed to the king was her sort of vibrancy, her exoticism, but she was different from other women at court.
Yeah, I think as you're saying, like it's so in the sources, it's like yeah, she's not that beautiful, but there's something about her that's really appealing and like attractive.
Yeah, and that obviously appealed to the king.
And poor Jane Seymour, because I know what you're on about. Shapley's absolutely blasted her in the sources.
Yeah, he really wasn't impressed by her, which is interesting considering he's said to be part of some kind of conspiracy to put her on the throne, but he didn't really seem all that impressed by her. Maybe he just thought she'd be easily managed.
Probably known Shapley. Could you tell us how Anne is viewed before her rise and after, once she becomes queen?
Yeah, we don't have much from before her rise because she wasn't really talked about, she wasn't commented on. She spent a lot of time on the continent. We do have a letter that Margaret of Austria wrote to Thomas Boleyn around 1512, 1513-ish, when Anne was at the court of Margaret in Mechlin. And Margaret writes to say how much she appreciated Thomas sending Anne to her, and that perhaps she was more beholden to him than he was to her for taking Anne, and that she was so pleasant for her young age. So she seems to have made quite an impression on Margaret of Austria quite early on. And, I think at this point, Anne would only have been about 12 years old. I don't think she would have been as young as 5 or 6 at this point. So I think she was probably around 12 years old. Um, and yeah, it's quite a sort of sterling accounting of Anne's character at this time, how she's been raised so far. And it seems to suggest high expectations of Anne for the future as well. Um, but her relationship with Henry VIII and his determination to annul the marriage to Catherine made Anne very unpopular. Um, Catherine of Aragon was an incredibly popular queen. She'd been queen for 24 years by the time Henry VIII married Anne. And Anne did have supporters at court. She had her sort of circle, especially those who shared her reformist beliefs. But there were also those looking for any chance to bring Anne down. They wanted to restore Catherine, restore Mary. So there's this sort of it is sort of factional politics, but it's not quite that, I guess, set up this early. It's sort of coming to the fore. But I think Anne as well, she must have lived in a climate of fear that the same would happen to her as Catherine of Aragon if she failed to produce a son. I don't think she could have foreseen it would be even worse than what happened to Catherine. But her downfall and execution weirdly seemed to swing opinion back in her favour in the end. Almost as soon as she died, people were questioning her guilt. So there seems to have been this sort of belief in her innocence almost before she even sort of was before her body was cold, effectively.
I
So
mean,
that
it is wild, isn't it?
it
How
is
it,
it's crazy, yeah, how things sort of swing backwards and forwards.
I think it shows as well, like how ridiculous her trial and death is. If like people that didn't even like Anne were like, what?
Yeah, I mean, Chapuis's a notable one there that he wrote, I think it was the day after her death, or within a few days of her death anyway, that people were questioning, murmuring against the verdict. So yeah, it's if even someone like Chapuis, who we know hated Anne, could write that, then yeah, there's obviously definitely some rumblings, at least in London.
So obviously Anne was executed on the 19th of May. We'll stifle our tears there, Helen. As we say that. How is Anne viewed after her death, and especially in the reign of her daughter, Elizabeth I?
Well, there's sort of everything goes quiet after May 1536 around Anne. As I said, we don't know whether Henry ordered the destruction of her things. They probably at least were put into storage and out of the way, given that, there was a new queen before the end of the month. Um, but yeah, and then sort of in the reign of Mary the First, it's sort of you couldn't speak positively of Anne, with Mary being Catherine of Aragon's daughter. Mary certainly hated Anne and what she'd done. Um, so yeah, we don't see any positive sort of interpretations of Anne in Mary's reign. If you talked about Anne, it would have been negatively at that point. But yeah, then we have Elizabeth coming to the throne against all the odds, really, has to be said. Um, and it's, we don't have, overt commentary really about Anne. We don't have Anne being reburied at any point, which I know some people have questioned as to why. And I think it was just because it would have brought up too much at that point. Anne had been, dead for over 20 years. I don't think Elizabeth felt the need to do it. I think she preferred to just leave her mother lie, and politically, it might have opened a lot of questions about her own legitimacy. Because we know Elizabeth never reinstated the marriage of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, which Mary did for Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She reinstated her mother's marriage. But we know Elizabeth did pass an act in her first parliament to restore Anne in blood as the Queen's mother. It's an act with a very, very long name. And right now I cannot remember the name of it. But it's an incredibly long titled act. And yeah, it's only recently I've sort of discovered that. And I think
Mm.
Natalie Grueniger mentioned it, and Tracy Borman in her book covers it as well. Um, it's something about an act whereby the Queen restored in blood to the late Queen Anne, her mother, or something. It's very convoluted. Um, but it's interesting because we do have these images of Anne reappearing, although how accurate they are is questionable. I think the checkers ring is an important one. I do believe that second image is Anne. I don't think it makes sense for it to be either a young Elizabeth or Catherine Parr.
Mm.
And the hood, again, I think rules out Catherine Parr and a young Elizabeth as well. I think the hood is too early. But we also have a life-size image of Anne appearing in Elizabeth's coronation procession. We see the use of the falcon emblem again. And we see these sort of portrait sets being created of kings and queens. And we have Anne featuring in those. It's possible the Hever Rose and the National Portrait Gallery portrait were originally parts of portrait sets that were created during Elizabeth's reign. So yeah, it's an interesting one that isn't entirely rehabilitated in Elizabeth's reign, but Elizabeth certainly is respecting her mother and quite possibly encouraging people to sort of restore her in name, if not in blood.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that. I think Elizabeth, I know a lot of people say Elizabeth never honoured her mother in any way. You see that a lot on social media now. But she did. I mean, no, she didn't rebury her, but I think, as you say, it would have been, I think it would have dredged up too much, as you say. It would have been a bit too much to dredge up.
Mm.
But I think restoring your mother's kind of like right to the throne, I think is arguably even more important than restoring the marriage.
Yeah, it's an interesting act because it's sort of the name of it doesn't it mentions Queen Anne, so she's very much sort of setting up her mother as the legitimate queen without actually legitimizing the marriage. But yeah, restoring in blood is I think that's quite potent about how Elizabeth felt about Anne, that she wanted to recognize Anne as her mother, which up until this point she hadn't really been able to do.
Could you tell us about Nicholas Sander? He's one of maybe the most famous contemporaries for talking about Anne Boleyn after her death.
Yes. He's I find him quite frustrating, I have to say. He has a very obvious propaganda aim to it. He wants to portray Anne as a heretic, not a witch. He never actually accuses Anne of witchcraft in his tract, I will say that. Um, it's a common misconception that the witchcraft myth came from Sander. And of course, Anne was never actually accused of witchcraft either. Sander wanted to portray Anne as a heretic to undermine Elizabeth and her religious settlement. Elizabeth was sort of tending away from Catholicism. I don't think we can say she was a Protestant. Um, I think it's more likely she tended down the same line of reform as Anne. And because she never renounced, the mass, or any, well, she didn't like the sort of, I guess, the pomp of the mass. We know she refused to attend during Mary's reign, but I don't think she ever denied transubstantiation. Um, she quite liked the vestments still to be worn, all things that Edward VI had sort of gotten rid of in his reign that Mary restored. And Elizabeth did keep quite a lot of them, but no pope. She again followed in her father's footsteps and refused to accept the pope as head of the church. But Sander is the source of the six finger myth, um, along with the big wen covered in moles. And if all of that was true, I don't think Henry VIII would have gone anywhere near her, frankly. I think Henry was precisely that shallow. Um, but yeah, Sander intended to make Anne sound monstrous to undermine Elizabeth. I will say that George Wyatt, the grandson of the poet Thomas Wyatt, does say that Anne may have had a slight showing of an extra fingernail on one hand. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Again, George Wyatt didn't know Anne. Um, so it's possible that Sander read that and ran with it, made it 10 times worse. I can't remember off the top of my head whether George Wyatt or Nicholas Sander published first. Um, so off the top of my head, I cannot remember that date. But yeah, Sander's work I think's got a lot to answer for with the Anna's monster and Anna's witch myths, and of course Anne Boleyn's portrait appears in Hogwarts in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone as well.
Little Anne cameo in Harry
Yeah,
Potter. Am I right in saying that Nicholas Sander wasn't alive in Anne's lifetime? Or he was very young?
he may have been born, but he would have been like a child. I can't remember his date of birth again off the top of my head. Um, so he may have been, but he certainly wouldn't have been around Anne. He wouldn't have known Anne personally.
Moving on to 19th century depictions of Anne, this is when we start to see Anne become a lot more popular again in that kind of culture. Could you tell us about Agnes Strickland's work on Anne Boleyn? And did she try to enforce Victorian ideals onto Anne?
I'd sort of delved into Strickland's work before on and off, but I never read a section on Anne beginning to end before. So that was quite interesting. But the section on Anne starts by saying there is no name in the annals of female royalty over which the enchantments of poetry and romance have cast such bewildering spells as that of Anne Boleyn. So you definitely get this sort of romantic ideal, but there's also that hint of witchcraft in there with the, casting bewildering spells. Um, and she goes on to say her wit, her beauty, and the striking vicissitudes of her fate, combined with peculiar mobility of her character, have invested her with an interest not commonly excited by a woman, in whom vanity and ambition were the leading traits. So I find that quite interesting because the first half sounds almost like Anne's a tragic heroine. She was a victim of a tyrannical husband. But the second half is more derogatory. Um, it's the undertone is that the mobility of character, the vanity and ambition are all negative traits in Victorian eyes. So it's quite an interesting way to open in that sort of juxtaposition of the two halves, um, and sort of broke the mold of what I think Victorians thought women should be. They should be submissive, obedient to their husbands. Although women were, of course, starting to break molds in the Victorian period themselves. But there is this sort of overwhelming assumption that women should have been submissive and obedient, and Anne was neither of those things at all. She reached outside sort of the strata of society she was born into, and stepped so far outside the boundaries as to be exceptional.
No, I agree. I think you can't put Anne in the box. She's not
No,
one to go on the shelf.
no, definitely not.
How and why, in the later half of the 19th century slash early 20th, is Anne starting to be viewed as a tragic heroine?
I think a lot of the interest in Anne, particularly early on, was on her fall and execution. And I think that automatically plays into the tragic heroine idea. It's only sort of fairly recently that we've started to look more at her childhood, her time on the continent, for instance, her earlier relationships with Henry Percy and Thomas Wyatt, assuming that the Wyatt relationship happened. That's still questionable. But it's been widely accepted, I think, across history that Anne was innocent. And that isn't just a recent sort of phenomenon to accept Anne as innocent. And that made her seem tragic because her life was cut so much shorter than it should have been. She didn't get to see her daughter grow up. Um, but I guess she also comes across as a heroine because Elizabeth I was so successful as queen. I think that's put onto Anne, to say, well, she gave birth to Elizabeth, therefore, she was also this successful woman. And Anne was successful, and I think she would have gone on to be more successful had she lived longer. We know she was passionate about charitable and educational causes, and I'm sure she would have gone on to promote more of those, perhaps found a college. Um, I can definitely see Anne doing something like that, and I think that would have made her more of a heroine, that she was known for her own actions rather than someone else's actions who she gave birth to. Um, because Anne was just, she was strong-willed, she was ambitious, she knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to say what she wanted, but she was destroyed by a tyrannical husband, which makes her, in a lot of ways, a victim.
Hmm. No, I agree. I think if Anne's life wasn't tragically cut shorter than it should have been, she would have done some great things for education, I think. I think she shows like in when she is queen for such a short time, she's really interested in poverty and education and having children have a better education.
Yeah, and we see her have that argument with Cromwell towards the end of her life over how the money from the dissolution of the monasteries would be spent, that Cromwell wanted to funnel it into the royal coffers. But Anne was very forthcoming on the fact that she believed it should be used for charity and education, and
Mm.
asked how they intended to do that, of which there didn't seem to be a plan, as far as I can tell from what we have.
On to the exciting stuff now. Stage and film. What was the first on-screen depiction of Anne Boleyn?
Well, the earliest one I discuss in the book is The Private Lives of Henry VIII, which was 1933, with Merle Oberon playing Anne Boleyn. I have come across a couple of earlier short films. I believe one's a silent film.
Hmm.
I think about 1912 and 1920 or 21. Um, but they're not very well known, and I haven't actually been able to find them. So I haven't been able to, try and see them. But The Private Lives of Henry VIII is an interesting one because Anne Boleyn is only on screen for about the first 12 to 15 minutes of the film, which seems unusual when modern sort of portrayals of the Tudors, Anne Boleyn is very much the focal point. That's what we see with Showtime's The Tudors. We have two series of Anne Boleyn, of the four series. Um, and even the Six Wives of Henry VIII, dramas and documentaries that we see, Anne Boleyn is very often the dominant character. So yeah, The Private Lives of Henry VIII sort of stood out because the only part of Anne's life we see is her execution.
Hmm.
It begins with Anne Boleyn's execution, sort of cut with scenes of Jane Seymour preparing for a wedding. So the focus isn't even just on Anne Boleyn either. Um, and it's sort of almost comedic in places, which I imagine it wasn't meant to be. But to 21st century eyes, I think it definitely comes across that way. There's a bit where the sort of audience for the execution sort of getting ready, and there's a woman complaining that someone stood in front of us got wearing too big a hat or something. It's just like, oh, okay, I didn't expect that. So I think it can come across as quite comedic in places where I'm not entirely sure it was meant to be that comedic.
I don't expect you to cover them all in your book, but could you tell us about some of the actresses that have depicted Anne over the years and how they vary in their depictions?
Well, Mill Oberon, I think because the film is shot in black and white, it stands out as a very different depiction just because of, the time we were just coming out of the Roaring Twenties. It was, the run up to war. And I think shooting in black and white almost makes it look more exotic to 21st century eyes. Genevieve Bujold in Anne of a Thousand Days really shows Anne's fire and passion. Um, but I don't think we get as much of the political and religious side of Anne. It's very much focused on the relationships. Though it was nice to see the relationship with Henry Percy portrayed as well. We don't see it play out in a lot of depictions. So yeah, I love that portrayal. We have Dorothy Tootin and Helena Bonham Carter playing Anne Boleyn in miniseries. Um, Bonham Carter, we again see the Percy affair, and we seem to see more of a demure Anne, that I
Mm.
don't think we're really used to seeing in the 21st century. Um, Natalie Portman and the other Boleyn girl, not one of my favorites. There's something about Natalie Portman's portrayal that I just can't get along with. Um, and yeah, there's something there. I mean, I loved Scarlett Johansson as Mary Boleyn,
Mm.
which is obviously who the story is supposed to be focused on anyway. But yeah, I'm not sure what it is with Natalie Portman. I felt like it didn't really capture Anne, in a way, which is quite sort of weird because I normally quite like the different interpretations we get of Anne from different actresses, but I didn't like that. Um, Natalie Dormer in the Tudors, we get a much more sexualized Anne. That whole first two series of that show is just a lot of sex generally. But we also get to see an Anne who is interested in religious reform. We see her introduce William Tyndale to the king. She gets very involved with religious matters. We see the argument with Cromwell depicted on screen, which is nice. Um, but she does come across as quite manipulative as well. Um, I'm not sure how manipulative Anne was. I think there may have been a streak of that in her, but I don't think it was probably as much as we see in Natalie Dormer's portrayal. Claire Foy in Wolf Hall is another one I really like. It's very different because we're seeing Anne through Cromwell's eyes. So the portrayal's quite unsympathetic in that way, but we definitely see a more political Anne. She's very involved with the great matter. And again, we see her sort of acting as an agent almost to the king. Um, but yeah, it is an unsympathetic portrayal just because it's seen through Cromwell's eyes. And Jodie Turner-Smith, the first Black woman to play Anne Boleyn. Um, I was actually disappointed in how Anne was portrayed in that one, um, just because her passion, her wit, her political savviness doesn't seem to come across at all. It felt quite 2D. And I've seen a lot of people, complain about the color of the actress's skin. Anne Boleyn wasn't, a colored woman. We know she was white. She's described as being sallow. So we know she was, fairly fair skinned. But that wasn't what bothered me. It was just the fact that Anne's character seemed all wrong from the evidence that we have. Um, it was interesting to see it, but it's not one that I would go back to, I don't think.
No, I agree with you there. It didn't bother me what Jodie's skin color
No,
was. I think she's a fantastic actress. I've seen her in other things. But I agree with you, it didn't really depict Anne. And
no.
Henry was weak in it as well. It's a bit, I mean, they have Anne kiss Jane Seymour at one point, so it seems just a bit wild, that one.
Yeah, it wasn't like I was watching a portrayal of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn.
No.
It didn't feel like, that was the Anne that I sort of found in the sources at all. Whereas the other interpretations, I think they may not be fully Anne, but you can see that, there's been source involvement that they've tried to pull out at least bits of Anne.
Mm.
Whereas I think Jodie Turner-Smith, I couldn't find any form of Anne in there at all. So yeah, it is what it is, I guess.
Have you got a favourite portrayal of Anne Boleyn?
I do, and it's Genevieve Bujold in Anne for 1,000 Days. She wasn't my first Anne. The first Anne I saw on screen was Natalie Dormer, in the Tudors. But when I saw Genevieve Bujold, I loved the passion and the fire. And we see that sunshine and storms relationship with Henry VIII, which we know they did have. They had these sort of very passionate moments and then these tempestuous arguments and then a passionate reconciliation. And, it continued throughout their relationship and through their marriage. And it's probably a big part why Henry VIII in the end couldn't cope with Anne anymore. She didn't, become this subservient, submissive wife that Catherine of Aragon was. And she had more power as mistress. I don't think she could change in that way. But I think the real Anne Boleyn probably lies somewhere between Genevieve Bujold and Claire Foy.
Ah, I'll take that. Genevieve Bujold's the best. I can't, she is. I know it's like one of the older depictions, but I think she does capture something of Anne that's like an enigma almost. She's almost the actress portrays the enigma.
Yeah, I think it was great when Susan Bordeaux interviewed Genevieve for her book, The Creation of Anne Boleyn, and she asked Genevieve, if someone else could portray Anne, who would you want it to be? And she just said, no one, Anne is mine. And I think that just shows how much she got involved in that role, that even all these years later, she still doesn't want anyone else to play Anne. And I think that just says a lot about her devotion to that role and how much she put into it as well.
Could you tell us about the most popular biographies regarding Anne?
For me, Eric Ives will always sit at the top. um, his is the sort of real Anne Boleyn Bible, despite the book being over 20 years old now. I think it first came out in 2004.
Mm.
So, some things that he writes have now changed. We've had, Kate McCaffrey's discoveries with books of hours. There's things that are now generally accepted that we might not have any evidence for, but are generally accepted that Ives thought something else. And I always love Ives' back and forth with G.W. Bernard. I think it's in the English Historical Review, and they were just trading articles across about a year, I think. And they're great to read because they just try and dismantle each other's arguments. Because G.W. Bernard is the only historian I think I've been able to find who believes Anne was guilty, which is an interesting one. He also has a book as well, which is an interesting read if you're interested in the arguments over guilt versus innocence. But there are the great biographies by Elizabeth Norton, Amy Licence has written a great one. Natalie Grueninger's The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, I think, is right up there as well. Any work by Owen Emerson and Kate McCaffrey, always going to be great. And I think they've done 3 books together now.
Yes, 3 books.
Becoming Anne, Catherine and Anne, and Holbein's Hidden Gem. Tracy Borman as well, her work on Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I. And I am looking forward to Heather Darcy's new book as well, which comes out in September, October time, or is it December?
I think it's December.
It's definitely late this year at some point. I can't remember off the top of my head. So yeah, there are some absolutely great books out there. But I almost feel like we've reached sort of the limit of biographies that we can get to because, there's a limit to sort of new interpretations, really. I mean, there are some new interpretations coming out. We've got, Natalie Grueninger and Heather Darcy looking at sort of Anne's final year. Estelle Perront looking at the French Connection as well. I haven't read hers yet. I have dipped in and out, but I've not yet read it cover to cover. So there are sort of new interpretations coming out, but I think that's what you need to write a book on Anne's. You need a new way of looking at it nowadays.
I mean, you've just squeezed one in there just before there's too many biographies. You just squeeze
Well,
it in
that's
there.
not really a biography, so I think I've hopefully done the sort of fairly new thing, although I know Stephanie Russo has done something similar. She sadly got in there before me while I was still planning this book, which was a little annoying, but I've been planning this for nearly 15 years, so it's nice to see it come to fruition.
Sorry, you've got time ahead of that. You beat it technically. Could you tell us about some of the historical fiction novels written about Anne and how some of them don't depict her in the best light compared to others? You know
Yeah,
what I'm on about.
yeah. I discuss 5 novels in my book. I don't actually look at Wolf Hall or The Other Boleyn Girl because I discuss them as screen adaptations. So I wanted to make sure I wasn't, double covering things. And there are so many novels out there that I wanted to look at the breadth of ways Anne's been perceived. I didn't just want to do, novels just telling Anne's story. I wanted to do something a bit different. Um, so I look at Alison Weir, who uses quite a traditional narrative, I think, in her Six Tudor Queen series. It wasn't actually my favorite of the series. I thought it would be, but I actually really enjoyed Jane Seymour's,
Mm.
um, which I haven't seen many people say is their favorite, actually. I've seen quite a few people say Catherine of Aragon was their favorite. But I did really enjoy Jane Seymour's. Um, Susanna Dunn, Queen of Subtleties, uses a dual narrative. So she also has a confectioner called Lucy. Um, so she does sort of alternate chapters telling Anne's story through the dual perspective. Jean Plaidy, I look at Murder Most Royal, though Anne figures in multiple of her books. But Jean Plaidy is always one of my favorites. I started reading her fairly young. Um, and my grandma was always a huge Jean Plaidy fan. I've been told my grandma died before I was born. So Jean Plaidy sort of felt like a way to sort of connect with the grandma that I'm never going to know. And then I discussed two, which are sort of a bit left field, a bit. So I do an alternative history, which is Laura Anderson's The Boleyn King, which is a possible story of what could have happened had Anne Boleyn's final pregnancy resulted in the birth of a son, and that son became king. So the story starts after Henry VIII's dead, as Anne's son is coming into his majority. So we see Anne as Dowager Queen, and we have her brother George as regent for Anne's son. So that was quite an interesting, different one to look at, a different perspective on Anne. And the last one I look at is really, really left field because it's actually based in the modern day.
Okay.
Uh, so that's I look at the first in the Kindred Spirit series by Jennifer C. Wilson, and I absolutely adore this series. And Jennifer Wilson is also local to me. So that's been really, really nice to cover it. It's based in the present day about ghosts living at the Tower of London. Um, so it features the ghosts of Anne and George Boleyn, Jane Grey, Catherine Howard, Richard III, George Duke of Clarence, among many others. And then sort of later books in the series, you go over to Westminster Abbey, so you get Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. There's one set on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. There's one in York. So you get all of these sort of different ghosts coming together. It's just a really sort of fun romp through some of the history. And Richard III wants to know what happened to the princes in the tower. So there's just lots of like little bits in it. And I will say the latest book in the series at the minute, though I believe she's writing another one, is called Regal Retribution, and it starts with the ghost of Henry VIII going to see Six the musical.
That's
So
great.
I'm gonna throw that out there. It's a really enjoyable series, and it's something I like going back to when I'm in the midst of heavy historical writing and want something a bit lighter to read. So I do return to it time and time again.
I'll have to add that to the list. That actually sounds really interesting.
It's really, really cool. I'd really recommend it. Just to throw out that it starts with Anne Boleyn and Richard III having a conversation, and one says to the other, "Where's George?" And the other says, "Yours or mine," because they both have brothers. And the Georges are both the pranksters playing tricks on tourists and things like that. So there's just lots of little comedic moments that are quite nice, along with some slightly more, serious discussions about princes in the tower and, missing ghosts and things like that.
I agree with your analysis on Alison Weir's book as well. It's not my favorite. It's
No,
you just I love Alison Weir. I love her.
I do.
But she doesn't like Anne Boleyn at the end of the day. She just doesn't like her.
No, I think you might be right there, but yeah. So which one's your favorite then, Jess?
It's either between Jane Seymour or Catherine Parr.
I do like Catherine Parr's as well. Yeah, I couldn't get on with Anne of Cleves either because that early
What?
pregnancy was like, what
Oh.
is going on here?
Now, Anna Cleves and Catherine Howard are a bit weak, but I think first, middle, and last are one of the stronger ones, I think.
yeah, the odd numbered ones,
Yeah.
apart from Catherine Howard.
I don't dislike Catherine Howard's story, but again, it just felt like she doesn't like Catherine Howard, so
She doesn't like the cousins.
she doesn't like the cousins. She doesn't like them. Does Anne's story and how she looks and who she is differ quite a lot in biographies compared to historical fiction?
Well, I think we need to remember that fiction's made for drama and entertainment. It's not meant to be factual. So there are producers, directors, writers are always going to pick out the juiciest moments from Anne's story and probably blow them out of all proportion. Um, that's why we get so much focus on her execution, um, because it was just a sensational moment in history. Um, Whereas biographies should be based on the contemporary historical sources, bringing in historian opinions and interpreting the surviving evidence. Um, you tend, in both fiction and biography, you get suggestions made to fill in the gaps. Although in fiction, it's not always obvious what is the fiction and what is the fact. Whereas biography should make it very obvious if there's a supposition being made, to say, this is what I think, but there are other opinions. And if they're really, really good, they should outline what those other opinions are.
Hmm.
It should never be one-sided, I don't think. And I think we do see that with some historians only putting forward their point of view, and then people accept it as fact, which is dangerous. So I think that's what I wanted to do with this book is I try and sort of subtly hint towards my opinions without actually throwing them in someone's face, because I think there are so many different interpretations of a lot of the surviving sources across the 500 years that I want people to make up their own minds. And, people get in touch with me and say, well, I think this about this source. And it'd be quite nice to open more dialogues, I think, about the surviving sources, because I find, particularly on social media, people can be very brutal if they disagree with you, and downright cruel at times. I know I've had that, and I've been upset about it, and in the end, I've just gone, I'm just going to block you, because if you're going to be rude, if you know, debate is good as long as it's polite and everyone's polite to each other. But when people start, being cruel, um, that's when I'm gonna that's when I'm gonna block people, frankly. I never used to. And it was just becoming a complete drain on my mental health. So now if you're cruel, if you start swearing, you're gonna get blocked, I'm afraid.
Block. No, I think obviously Anne Boleyn always causes debate,
Yeah.
and that is one of the downsides to research. I think is there's always going to be a debate. But I mean, I had one a few months ago when I did an interview for the History Roadshow. I was discussing. I think one of the questions was about Anne Boleyn, but it was more like a general overview. And the comment was like, "Do you know what? I'm fed up of seeing historians have such rose-tinted glasses when it comes to Anne Boleyn." It's like, what?
A good historian doesn't have rose-tinted glasses. You have to accept no one's wholly good or wholly bad. There's always going to be shades of grey. And I think we just need to be careful, because fiction is always going to blur the lines between what's fact and what's fiction. But yeah, I think debate is really, really good, because often I know my opinion's been changed on things by debate, or I've gone and looked up a different source that I didn't realize, because someone's just, very politely said, oh, have you thought about reading this source? Have you looked at this? And I've gone, oh no, thank you. I'll go and have a look. Um, and then sometimes, I've gone back to them and gone, oh yeah, I looked at this source. It's quite interesting. And, as long as people are polite about it, I'm
Hmm.
always willing to have a debate. But yeah, just don't start swearing at me and insulting anyone, me or anyone else who might be commenting on my posts, which I've also had before. Um, so yeah, I think we're always going to debate, and I think half the fun of studying Anne Boleyn is that there is so much unknown. But as you said, it's frustrating. But if we knew everything, we wouldn't need to research.
Mm, very true. How have we kept alive Anne's image and spirit in the 21st century?
I think kind of naturally over time, interest has grown since those pesky Victorians, who, really, I guess Queen Victoria had quite a sort of personal interest in Anne. And from then, it's just sort of snowballed almost out of recognition. Popular culture and social media played a huge role. The amount of times I get people commenting things like, "Oh, I saw it in the other Boleyn girl, so it must be true." Help. And try and politely prompt people to go and look at the original sources because quite often they're more interesting than anything in fiction anyway. And there are still, new discoveries being made. Owen Emerson and Kate McCaffrey's work, Lucy Churchill's recreation of the portrait medal. And there are still lots of gaps that we just don't know how to fill and likely never will be able to fill. I can't imagine someone suddenly going to come up against a source that tells us exactly when Anne Boleyn was born, for instance. I don't think that's likely to happen. We're never going to know the ins and outs of her relationship with Henry VIII, how they really felt about each other. And I think that's what keeps it alive, is just that there are things that are unknown. She keeps reappearing in the news. There's constant exhibitions. And I think it just keeps interest alive, really. And people are always fascinated by Henry VIII. So I think any connection to him is always going to prompt interest.
This is a bit of a fun question. It's our last question about your book. What memorabilia can we get with Anne's face, her classic bee pendant, and anything Anne Boleyn themed?
Well, I think you can get pretty much anything with Anne's face, her bee necklace, her motto, words from a book of hours. I have mugs, cushions, portrait prints, Christmas baubles, bookmarks, pin brooches, jugs, necklaces. If you can name it, you can probably get it, frankly. One of my favorites has to be I've got a sort of pin for my coat, and it's a black cat with Anne Boleyn's necklace. And it's from the lovely Laura, who runs Life and Tea on Etsy. I also have about 4 of her bookmarks. I have 2 others of her pins as well. So I also have the Henry VIII one and the Elizabeth I one. And she's just released a Jane Seymour one with a baby Edward cat as well, which it's in my basket. I haven't quite hit that yet. I'm debating if there's anything else I want. So yeah, there's loads and loads of like things you can get. I also have a Tudor rose clock. I have a garden gnome in the shape of Henry VIII. So there's lots and lots of things you can get. It's interesting really as to why we do it, why we have so much Anne Boleyn stuff. And I don't think anyone really knows how, why, or where it started, to be honest. It's just sort of snowballed through time, I think. And I think 21st century, we're very much need to buy things culture that I think didn't really exist in the past. We have a lot more disposable income when we're not in a cost of living crisis anyway. But yeah, I think just generally the fact that we have a lot more disposable income means people are producing more things that we can buy. But Henry VIII doesn't get the same attention, and neither did the other 5 wives. But I think with Anne, her end was so shocking that it just draws people in. And there's so many unknowns, like I said before, that it just, we have her childhood home to go to. We have the place that she died. We have places that she lived. So I think having those concrete sort of things as well is quite a useful sort of way to sell things, I guess.
Towards the end of the podcast, as you know, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. So, from when we recorded earlier this year, have you got a new historical pet peeve?
I did have to go back and actually see which pet peeve I'd actually said the last time to make sure I'm telling you a different one. I do have several. So this time I'm going to say people who believe so strongly that their opinion is right that they won't listen to alternatives, because that's not what history is about. Unless we have a solid fact in a contemporary source, not something that's written 100, 150 years later, a contemporary source, it can always be disproved or debated. And history is about debate. It's not about asserting yourself and then ignoring anyone who has a different opinion. It's more common to not know something than to know something in history. And I think that's always important to remember.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
I think it's going to be a bit obvious, but it's going to be Anne Boleyn. I'd be fascinated to know what she was actually like in person,
Mm,
because we have so many, contradicting accounts from ambassadors, and because she was, so controversial, I don't think we've ever really had an account of who she really was, because everyone sees different things. And I want to be able to, ask her all the things I'm dying to know, but that we'll never know.
If you could serve any Tudor queen consort, who would it be and why?
Don't worry, my answer to this one's not Anne
Oh,
Boleyn.
okay, okay.
I think it would actually have to be Catherine Parr. Um, she was intelligent, educated, a writer. She always seems to have encouraged, bear in mind, I'm not a massive Catherine Parr aficionado. She always seemed to encourage those around her to learn
Yes.
and to educate themselves and improve themselves. And I think that must have been just such an inspiring environment to be in, even if you were under constant threat from Henry VIII, as Catherine Parr seems to have been. Um, I still think Catherine Parr's household just must have been an inspiring place to be in.
No, I agree. I think Catherine Parr must have been, well, Bonnie will soon tell us.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
When she's listening to this, actually, yes, I have something to say about
yeah. I have no doubt at all. I'll hear from
that.
Bonnie at some point.
But no, I think Catherine Parr's a really inspiring woman, and I can imagine Catherine Parr and Anne Boleyn would have been friends.
Yeah, I can as well. If it wasn't for the, I believe, probably 11-year age gap.
Oh yeah.
But you never know.
You never know. If you could discover one thing about Anne Boleyn, what would it be and why?
The thing I really, really want to know, I mean, people, tend to say when she was born, or, what she looked like. But the thing I really want to know is whether she really did love Henry VIII.
Mm.
And if she did, I do believe she did at some point. When did it happen? Was it straight away? Was it further into their relationship? Was it during their marriage? I find the latter hard to believe. I think it happened sometime before they were married. Um, but it would just be interesting to know sort of when, and did that influence her decision to accept his marriage proposal, if it was early. Um, so yeah, I think that's an important question that could tell us a lot about Anne's motives at different points. Because I think that's still very much an open question, um, as to what was going on in Anne's head, and I think that could give us a great insight into her character.
No, I think that's a good one because I think, as you say, we might understand her so much better if we knew when she falls for Henry. If she did
Mhm.
fall for Henry, it's like it's one of those like I'm not that bothered about when she was born. I just kind of want to know, did she actually like want to be with Henry?
Yeah, that's another good one. Did she actually want that, or was it sort of almost forced on her by the king, who you couldn't really turn down, let's be honest?
And finally, have you got a favorite historical fact?
I should have checked this on the last episode as well, because I've got a feeling I may be about to give you the same historical fact last time, and I didn't check that bit of it. Um, but the fact that led me to write Tudor executions, that by the end of the Tudor period, there were no dukes left in England because the Tudors had killed them all. So we have this sort of over 50-year period where there are no dukes in England, which I always find quite fascinating, given how powerful dukes were, the top of the nobility under the king.
Just kept executing them. Didn't
Yeah,
like them.
I did just kill them all.
Didn't really like them, so just get
No.
rid.
And of course, the last one who was executed was a Howard. So Elizabeth I executed her own second cousin or something. I can't
Oh
remember
dear.
the exact, can't remember the exact relationship.
Oh dear, Elizabeth. Very
Yeah,
Thank you so much for coming back on to the podcast in the same year.
you're very welcome, Jess.
Your new book is, I think it's your best yet. I've got to be honest, I think it's your best. Yes. There's more to come because you've told me that there's another one on the way.
Yeah, I've finished a draft of my fourth book now. It's not submitted yet. It's with my friend who is doing some proofreading for me.
No, you should be really proud. And listeners, if you haven't bought it yet, what are you doing? Okay.
Thanks, Jess.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.